There was something almost ceremonial about sitting down at a typewriter. You didn't just plop into a chair and start clacking away. No, it was deliberate. You cleared space. You slid in a fresh sheet of paper. You rolled it into place with a few sharp turns of the platen knob. You aligned the paper just right. And only then, only when it looked perfect, did you let your fingers hover over the keys. And those keys, they weren't soft. They had resistance. They pushed back. Each letter came with a click and a punch. You felt every word in your fingertips. You knew when you made a mistake, because the typewriter didn't let you forget. There was no backspace, no delete, just that glaring black mark, that letter out of place. And if you were really unlucky, you had to start the whole page over. But that made it matter more. You didn't type recklessly. You thought first. You planned. You gave your words weight because they had to earn the ink. Every stroke was intentional. Every paragraph was fought for. There was no such thing as casual typing. It was all in or nothing. Your brain had to dance with your fingers, sentence by sentence, knowing that each keystroke was a step you couldn't take back. The sound was unmistakable. That a rhythm of letters snapping into place, the ding at the end of each line, the zip of the carriage return. It was music in a way. Not always pretty, but always real. It was the soundtrack of effort, of concentration, of trying to get it right. Late at night, that clack-clack ding became a lullaby to anyone nearby, and a reminder that someone was working through their thoughts, one keystroke at a time. In schools and offices and bedrooms across the country, people hunched over typewriters, notebooks open beside them, coffee mugs leaving rings on the desk, fingers smudged with correction fluid, and in those moments, you weren't just writing, you were committing. The act itself was physical. You pressed down hard. You left impressions on the page beneath, sometimes even on the wooden desk itself. It left a mark in every sense, because there was no undo, no shortcut, just the page in front of you, and the hope that this time you'd get it right the first time. You measured twice, typed once, and if you didn't, you had to pay for it, with time, with whiteout, with patience, with humility. You had to own your mistakes. There was no hiding them behind a polished screen or a clever edit. It was raw, honest, and very, very human, and somehow that made every word feel a little more honest. The mistakes were part of the story, the scratched-out lines, the pages in the trash, the crumpled drafts. They all told you something. This wasn't easy. It was earned. You weren't just creating something. You were working through it with every flawed page and every triumphant line. Even the ribbons had their own personality, starting bold and crisp, then slowly fading, until you had to swap them out. A fresh ribbon felt like a new voice, clearer and louder. A faded one made your thoughts look like whispers. You had to learn the machine's moods, when to push, when to ease up, and heaven help you if the keys jammed because you were untangling metal with ink-stained fingers for the next 5 minutes. And then there were the margins, those little metal sliders you adjusted manually. They dictated where your thoughts began and ended. They defined your space. You could feel the machine resisting as you tried to go too far, dinging with a warning, telling you to pull back, to stay within the lines. It was mechanical discipline, tangible boundaries you couldn't ignore. You learned to work inside them, not unlike the constraints life gave you. And that taught something. Creativity doesn't vanish under limits. Sometimes it sharpens. But in all of that, the sounds, the pressure, the mess there was a kind of dignity. It was a way of saying, this matters, of showing that you were willing to wrestle with your own ideas, that you believed what you had to say deserved to exist in black and white. And so we kept typing, carefully, honestly, hopefully, because in those clacks and dings and ribbon smudges we found something solid, something real, something that didn't depend on signal strength or screen resolution. It was slow, yes, and sometimes frustrating, but in that slowness there was clarity, a chance to think, a moment to feel, a space to mean every single word, a sacred pause in a world that rarely stopped moving, where writing wasn't just expression but devotion. We didn't write to impress an algorithm. We weren't chasing clicks. We typed because we had something to say, and because the act of saying it, of putting it down in ink, meant something. And maybe that's what made those old pages feel so special. Not that they were perfect, but that they were labored over, felt, fought for, real. Everyone remembers their first time using a typewriter, not because it was easy, but because it wasn't. There was a steep learning curve, and it wasn't just about figuring out which key did what. It was about learning rhythm, restraint, and respect. You didn't just sit down and expect it to flow. You sat, fumbled, rewound. Your pinky wasn't strong enough to press the shift key. Your timing was off. You forgot to return the carriage. Or worse, you forgot to insert paper and typed a beautiful paragraph straight into the roller. There was no autosave, just a reminder that every mistake was permanent, unless you physically fixed it. And so you learned quickly because you had to. School typing classes were where many kids got their first real taste. You sat at long rows of desks, the air filled with the metallic scent of ink ribbons and the constant percussive clatter of keys. The teacher paced the rows like a conductor of a very chaotic orchestra, calling out ASDF and JKL semicolon, while you tried to keep your fingers on the home row and your eyes off the keys. Muscle memory didn't come overnight. It came with repetition, with error, with sweat, and occasionally tears. And yet over time something shifted. That awkwardness turned into flow. That hesitation gave way to confidence. You no longer hunted for each letter, you felt it. You stopped thinking about the machine and started thinking about the words. The typewriter faded into the background, and your thoughts stepped forward. But it wasn't just about technical skill. Learning to type on a typewriter taught a kind of patience and humility that no modern device can. It reminded you that perfection was never promised, that every sentence was a risk, that writing was work and beautiful for that very reason. You came to expect imperfections, and in doing so, you grew more forgiving of your own flaws. And as you learned, you developed rituals. Everyone had theirs. Some people kept a stash of correction tape, or whiteout, within arm's reach. Others kept a backup ream of paper hidden behind books or under the bed. Some liked to type with classical music in the background. Others swore by silence. But no matter the ritual, the goal was the same: to find that elusive zone where thoughts met fingertips without interruption. You learned to listen to the machine. A strange thing, maybe, but true. You could hear when a ribbon was getting tired. You could feel when a key was starting to stick. And when something didn't sound right, when the rhythm was off, you knew it wasn't the typewriter. It was you. You'd lost your thread. You'd drifted off the point. And so you stopped, stretched your hands, reread your last few lines, and started again. Typewriters didn't just teach you how to write. They taught you how to revise. Not with ease, but with intention. You learned to scan a sentence carefully before typing it. You became your own editor reluctantly but effectively. Because the cost of a mistake wasn't just aesthetic. It was physical. Correction fluid, paper wasted, time lost, pride dented. And while that might sound cruel in a way, it was the kindest thing a machine could teach: to pause, to think before acting, to weigh your words, to slow down in a world that often pushes for speed. As you grew more comfortable, you began to experiment. You tested out dialogue, poetry, lists, speeches, love letters, angry letters, apologies, dreams. You typed things you never said out loud, things you didn't even know you felt, until they landed one tap at a time on the page. And maybe that was the real magic. Not just that the typewriter taught you how to type, but that it taught you how to listen to yourself. Because when you sat down at that machine, the world got quieter. Not silent, but quieter. Just enough to hear your own voice again. Just enough to notice the rhythm of your thoughts, the pulse of your ideas. And in that space, half mechanical, half mystical, you learned more than how to write. You learned how to be. There was a particular music to the typewriter, a kind of rhythm that threaded itself into daily life. It wasn't just the clack-clack ding of the keys and carriage. It was the way that sound lingered, the way it echoed in kitchens, basements, and bedrooms. It was a constant companion to thoughts being born, to dreams being tested on paper. You didn't need headphones or a playlist to get in the mood. The machine was the soundtrack, and every home seemed to have one: the hum of a manual Remington in the corner, the loud metallic slam of an electric IBM Selectric in the office, the faint ping of a child's first toy typewriter, echoing from another room. It was layered human noise, different than today's sterile tapping on glass. That sound told a story. If you heard it in the evening, it meant someone was chasing a deadline. If it came in short bursts, someone was writing a letter. Long, steady lines, maybe a novel, or a journal, or the angriest thing they'd never send. The sound told you someone was thinking out loud, just not with their voice. Parents would type out grocery lists while kids sat cross-legged nearby. Teens would hammer out college applications with sweaty palms and overused thesauruses. And late at night, you could sometimes hear the gentle tick of a solitary keystroke. Someone working through something big alone in their thoughts, with only the typewriter to keep them honest. There was something soothing about it, predictable, like rain on a tin roof. But it also had edge. When you were angry, you typed harder. The sound turned sharp, loud, urgent. The machine took it all in your frustration, your hope, your fear, and spat it back in ink. You didn't just write your feelings. You heard them. Neighbors could tell when you were on a roll. You'd build speed, no hesitations, the keys dancing like drums in a parade. And when you hit that final ding and yanked the carriage back, it was triumphant, victorious. That return sweep was a punctuation mark in itself, like saying, yes, that line, that one. And then there was silence, the kind of silence that came after the final page was pulled free, when the machine sat still, waiting, like it too needed to catch its breath. That pause was heavy, sacred, because in that stillness you realized you'd just made something from nothing, just sound and steel and stubbornness. You didn't always notice the soundtrack while it was playing, but years later the memory comes back in full volume. The weight of the keys, the echo in the hallway, the way your words sounded before they ever made it into anyone's hands. And in that sound, you find something you didn't realize you'd lost. A tempo that can't be sped up. A music that doesn't come from speakers. A kind of noise that once upon a time told us we were alive. We were trying. We were writing. Sometimes the music was communal. In a newsroom or classroom, you'd hear dozens of typewriters going at once, syncopated, overlapping, buzzing with a kind of collective urgency. You could feel the tension in the air, stories being broken, ideas being born, deadlines being chased. It was loud, chaotic, but strangely unifying. It brought people together under the shared mission of making words count. And then there were moments when the music was entirely your own. Alone in a quiet house, maybe late on a Sunday, the soft tap-tap of the keys became a whisper, a confession, a rhythm not for performance, but for reflection. Writing on a typewriter didn't always demand an audience. Sometimes it was just about getting something out of your head so you could breathe again. Even the flaws in the sound had meaning. The occasional double strike, the accidental overtype, the faint rattle of a worn spring, those imperfections became part of the memory. You didn't edit them out. You remembered them, because they reminded you that a machine was only as perfect as the human using it. And perhaps that's what we miss most about the sound of typewriters. They were honest, loud when we were loud, awkward when we stumbled, graceful when we were in flow. They didn't pretend. They simply echoed who we were in that moment. So when we remember the typewriter, we don't just remember the look or the feel. We remember the sound, the music of meaning being made. A symphony of keys and ideas and moments we can't quite replicate. Because back then, every page was a performance and every sentence had a sound. Before we ever typed a word, there was preparation. Not just mental, but physical. You had to sit at the desk, center the chair, dust off the machine. Sometimes you had to change the ribbon, and if you've never done that, let me tell you, it left your fingers stained like you'd been fingerprinted by history itself. You'd shuffle through paper, pick the cleanest sheet, and roll it in like you were feeding the machine its next meal. There was care in it, precision. The paper had to align just so, otherwise your sentences would slope across the page like they were dizzy, and nobody wanted crooked thoughts. And then there was the first tap, the first word. It always felt like crossing a line. Like once you hit that first key, there was no going back. The page was no longer blank. The commitment had been made, and somehow that commitment gave you clarity. It told your brain, all right, we're doing this now. There were rituals we didn't name, but followed like gospel. The way we'd blow on the page before starting again as if to brush away invisible doubts. The way we'd rub our hands together when the ideas weren't coming fast enough. The way we'd stop to stretch our necks and roll our shoulders like athletes in between rounds. And when inspiration struck, it was electric. You didn't just sit and write, you attacked the page. You leaned into the machine, your fingers flying your thoughts, racing to stay ahead. The carriage return became a beat, a loop, a rhythm that matched your pulse. It wasn't work anymore. It was performance. It was instinct. But just as often you stalled. You'd sit there staring at the same word over and over, wondering if it was the right one. You'd start a sentence and then rip the page out halfway through because it just didn't sound right. And yet we kept going, because even the bad pages taught us something. taught us patience, taught us discipline. Every line was earned, every paragraph a small victory. There was no autocorrect to catch you, no red squiggle to shame you. You had to trust your gut, and if you didn't, well, you learned to forgive yourself, reach for the correction fluid, and keep going. Even the mistakes became part of the story. You'd read an old letter and see where a word was typed over 3 times, and you knew right there someone paused, someone hesitated, someone cared. You could see the thinking on the page, and that made it real. We didn't call it mindfulness back then, but that's what it was. You couldn't multitask on a typewriter. There were no distractions, no pop-ups, no pings, just you and the page and the weight of your own thoughts. And in that space, we learned to listen to ourselves, to slow down, to make our minds sit still long enough to speak. There was a stillness to it all, a rhythm not just of fingers, but of focus, of quiet rooms and ticking clocks, of rustling pages and sighs that meant I'm getting there. It was a kind of presence we rarely have now, unshared, uninterrupted, undivided. And in those moments, the ritual of writing wasn't just about creating something for others. It was about reconnecting with something inside ourselves, something slower, quieter, truer. And maybe that's why so many of us still remember the smell of ink ribbons and the sound of clicking keys with such fondness. Because it wasn't just about producing words, it was about experiencing them. The typewriter didn't just document our thoughts, it became a mirror, a reminder that our inner world was worth putting down, worth pausing for. And sometimes those pauses were the most powerful part of the process. They reminded us that slowness isn't laziness, that deliberation isn't doubt. On a typewriter, every pause held weight. Every hesitation was a choice. Every key pressed was a declaration. There was no backspace to erase our indecision. We had to own it live with it and fold it into the narrative. That's what the typewriter gave us, not just a way to write, but a reason to stop, to breathe, to listen. It wasn't just a tool. It was a rhythm, a metronome of thought. And every time we sat in front of it, we weren't just writers, we were witnesses to our own emotions, to our own convictions, to the silence that made us speak. And we didn't even know how much we needed that until it was gone. There was a time when errors didn't just disappear. They stared back at you from the page, loud, bold, and unapologetic. On a typewriter, you couldn't pretend they didn't happen. You couldn't hit delete and erase the past. You had to face it, and that did something to you. You learned to be careful, not anxious, not afraid, but intentional. Every word had to be chosen, not just thrown out casually like a tweet or a text message. You paused before you typed. You thought before you committed. And if you didn't, the page told on you. There was something oddly honest about that. A typo was proof you were human. A misspelled word meant you were thinking faster than you could type, and crossing something out that was a kind of courage, not failure. It meant you were editing in real time, showing your work as you went. Back then, correction fluid wasn't just a tool, it was a second chance, a tiny bottle of grace. But it was slow. You had to wait for it to dry, and sometimes that waiting was part of the lesson. It gave you space to rethink, to breathe, to ask yourself, is this really what I want to say? Mistakes taught us not just about spelling or syntax, but about ourselves. They were little moments of humility, of restraint. They said, you're not perfect, but you're still trying. And honestly, isn't that all we ever needed to hear? There was also an artistry to fixing things. Some people got creative. They'd type over a letter 2 or 3 times to make it clearer. Others would retype an entire page just to get one sentence right. It wasn't always practical, but it was passionate, and that passion gave the page a kind of soul. Every document carried fingerprints, not literal ones, although there were those too, but emotional fingerprints. You could tell who wrote something not just by their words, but by their rhythm, their typos, their smudges, their stops and starts, their hesitations. We didn't have fonts back then. No bold or italic to lean on. If you wanted to emphasize something, you hit the key harder, or you spaced it out, or you used caps, but not for shouting, just for care. It was subtle. It was thoughtful. It made you pay attention. And we did pay attention. Not just to the finished product, but to the process. Because every page was a journey. You didn't write in bursts and bits between distractions. You sat. You stayed. You fought with the page until you found peace. And when you finished, there was pride. Not because it was perfect, but because it was yours. You'd hold the page up to the light and see where the ink had hit heavier. You'd feel the indentations. You'd know I made this. Mistakes didn't ruin that feeling. They deepened it. They made the work honest, tangible, true. We didn't chase flawless, we chased finished. We chased real. And in a world now full of filters and edits and endless do-overs, there's something sacred about that. About knowing your words were once permanent. About remembering a time when writing wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. Sometimes I miss the messiness of it. The clatter of keys, the slight panic when your ribbon ran out mid-sentence. The way your fingers would ache after an hour, but your heart would feel lighter. The way you could see a smudge and know it came from a moment of pause. That you touched your temple while thinking then the page. That the ink carried more than just words, it carried moments. There's something to be said for the confidence it built. When you worked through an error without crumpling the page in frustration, you learned patience. When you fixed a typo and moved forward, you learned perseverance. When you looked at a finished page full of effort and imperfection and still smiled, you learned acceptance. We came to see those imperfections not as blemishes, but as markers of our growth. They were part of the story, evidence of the struggle, the process, the persistence. The journey mattered as much as the destination, and in some ways maybe even more. It's funny how, now in an age where everything is editable and deletable, we sometimes long for those flaws, those tiny reminders that the hands behind the words were real, that the thoughts took effort, that the story came with sweat and second-guessing. Mistakes in that sense were a kind of intimacy. They drew the writer and the reader closer. They whispered, this was lived in, this was fought for, this was human. That's the thing about mistakes. They remind us we were there, that we tried, that we cared enough to press on even when it wasn't easy. And maybe that's the most unforgettable part of it all. Because long after the typewriters went silent, we still remember what they taught us. That what matters isn't writing something flawless. It's writing something true. And sometimes that truth comes with typos and smudges and sentences rewritten 4 times until they finally feel like yours. There was something deeply satisfying about the feel of a typewriter. Not just the look of it, but the touch. The keys were heavier, deliberate. You had to press with intention. There was no tapping or brushing lightly across a screen. Each letter demanded its own moment of effort, its own tiny act of decision. And with every keystroke came a sound, a rhythm. Click-clack, click-clack. It wasn't background noise. It was presence, proof that something was being made. We wrote with our bodies as much as our minds. Fingers learned the keys not as abstractions, but as extensions of thought. Wrists adapted. Shoulders found their posture. There was a choreography to it, mechanical, yes, but also intimate. Each press a physical echo of what we were trying to say. The typewriter didn't let you hide. You couldn't write from the back of your mind. You had to be there fully, because it wouldn't let you fake fluency. It asked for focus. It asked for honesty. And in return, it gave you a page that felt like work and pride. You didn't rush through writing on a typewriter. Even when you were fast, you weren't careless. The machine was a partner, a pace setter. It made you stop, even if just for a second before you reached the end of a line and had to push the carriage back. That little moment where the world paused and the page waited was part of the rhythm, a kind of breath. And what a sound that carriage return made. A sharp ding, a satisfying slide like punctuation in motion. It was a reminder, keep going, start the next line. There's more to say. Even the imperfections became part of the personality. Misaligned letters, worn-out keys, that stubborn lowercase e that always looked faint. The quirks of your machine became part of your voice. You didn't fight them, you adapted. You worked with them. Because that's what real writing was not about, control, but collaboration. And let's not forget the paper. Real paper. Thick-textured, smelling faintly of dust and ink. We didn't write into a void, we wrote onto something we could touch. Something that would yellow over time. Something we could fold, save hold to our chest. You didn't scroll. You flipped. You stacked. Pages had weight. When you were done, you didn't just have a file, you had a pile. A physical testament to your thoughts. One you could hand to someone else with trembling fingers, saying, "This is what I made." There's a courage in that kind of sharing, in handing over something that can't be polished with one more backspace, in letting your words exist out in the open flaws and all without a safety net. That kind of vulnerability, the kind born from permanence, is rare now, and precious. We didn't just write with our fingers. We wrote with our backs, our necks, our lungs. Long sessions left us sore, but also fulfilled. It felt like doing something that mattered, even if no one ever read it. The act itself was enough. And because it was harder, it meant more. Because it was slower, it went deeper. Because it couldn't be undone, it made us deliberate. Not perfect, never perfect, but present. In many ways, the typewriter wasn't just a tool. It was a teacher. It taught us discipline, patience, humility. It taught us to make do, to pay attention, to take pride. And most of all, it taught us that what we write matters not because it's flawless, but because it's felt. The weight of each key press wasn't just physical, it was emotional. You could feel the resistance, that split second of friction, before the letter met the ribbon. It reminded you that effort was part of creation, that ease wasn't the goal, meaning was. And sometimes late at night, with the lamp casting a warm circle on the desk, and the rest of the house quiet, the sound of your own typing became a kind of prayer, a meditation, a private little drumbeat of thought turned tangible. You weren't just writing, you were remembering, inventing, hoping, healing. The tactile nature of typing made writing feel like an event, not something you squeezed between appointments or multitasked into oblivion, but something sacred. You cleared space for it, made time for it, prepared for it, like you would for a meal or a meeting with someone you loved. And when the words came out wrong, as they often did, you didn't curse the machine. You took a breath. You started again, because the typewriter didn't expect perfection. It only expected effort. And in the end, that's all most of us needed. There was even a ritual to ending a piece. Removing the final page, stacking it neatly, maybe slipping it into a folder or envelope. That act was closure. A small ceremony that said, I did this. I finished something. Sometimes we'd look over those pages weeks later and find typos we missed. But instead of shame, we often felt affection. Those mistakes were ours. They were honest. They were proof that we were learning. Even now, when so much of our writing lives in invisible files and instant messages, a part of us still yearns for that solidity, for something we can touch, smell, stack, and save. A relic of effort, a reminder of process. That's the tactile truth of it all. Sometimes you have to feel something to believe it. And back then we felt every word, and every word felt like it mattered. If writing on a typewriter demanded effort, correcting mistakes required humility. There was no delete key, no blinking cursor to backspace your way out of an error. When you misspelled a word, you had a few options, and none of them were subtle. You could use correction fluid, that little bottle of white paint, with a tiny brush, and wait for it to dry before trying again. Or if you were fancy, you might have a correction ribbon built into your machine, letting you strike through the mistake with a layer of white film. But most of us, we backspaced and overtyped, turning a single letter into a blocky mess that looked like it had been attacked by pixels from the future. And we lived with it. We didn't pretend it was perfect. We learned to move on. Each correction was a confession we'd made a mistake. We tried to fix it, and we kept going. There was honesty in that, a kind of grace. Sometimes if the page was too far gone, too many errors, too many messy lines, we'd sigh, roll out the paper, ball it up, and toss it toward the trash can. That sound, the crinkle of failure, was almost a rite of passage. But even then there was something satisfying in the weight of the paper as it hit the bin. It meant you were trying. You were wrestling with words. You were making something real. And when you finally typed a clean page, no mistakes, just line after line of solid thought, that was victory. That was gold. That was a high no word processor has ever quite replicated. It wasn't just about getting it right. It was about earning it. These days we edit endlessly. We move whole paragraphs with a click rewrite sentences until they're polished to a shine. But back then we committed. Once it was on the page, it stayed there. We thought longer before we wrote. We planned our sentences more carefully. We learned to think through our words before our fingers followed. There was a quiet kind of confidence that came from that. A knowledge that what you put on the page had already passed through layers of internal scrutiny. It wasn't spontaneous. It was intentional. And yet sometimes the best lines were the unplanned ones. The ones that slipped through in a moment of boldness or exhaustion, or accidental brilliance. You'd pause, look at the words you just typed, and realize they were better than you'd expected, maybe even better than you deserved, and you'd leave them there afraid that changing them might break the magic. The act of writing became a balance between discipline and freedom planning, and surprise control, and surrender. And the typewriter, it was the perfect medium for that balancing act. It didn't rush you. It didn't judge you. It simply offered a blank page and waited to see what you would do. And because it required effort, every page carried weight, not just in grams, but in meaning. You remembered what you wrote, and where, and how long it took to get there. You remembered the frustration, the flow, the moments when the words finally clicked. So yes, we made mistakes, plenty, but we also made progress. And we learned slowly, surely, that there's power in persistence, that sometimes the only way forward is through the mess, through the clumsy fingers and ink-stained margins, through the typos and the rewrites and the long hours when it felt like nothing was working. The typewriter taught us that the first draft mattered, that every draft mattered, because every version, every attempt, every retyped sentence was a stepping stone, a way to say, I'm still here. I'm still writing. I still believe this is worth doing. And more than that, it reminded us to take pride in imperfection, because perfection is an illusion, but intention, effort, and honesty, those are real. You can feel them in every misaligned line, in every crossed-out word, in every page, rescued from the trash and started again. It was never about being flawless. It was about being faithful to the work, to the process, and to the quiet voice inside that said, try again. And so we did, again and again, because that's what writers do. The sound of a typewriter wasn't just background noise. It was a rhythm, a pulse, a beat you could feel in your bones. Each key had weight. Each strike had consequence. There was a percussive poetry to it, a clickety-clack that seemed to signal something is happening here. Words are being born. Ideas are taking shape. You didn't need a timer to know someone was working. You just needed to listen. The bursts of typing, the pauses of thought, the ding of the carriage return, the zip of the platen sliding back to the left. It was a soundtrack to creativity, a kind of music composed not with notes, but with letters. Sometimes the typing came fast, almost frantic. Inspiration had struck, and the fingers raced to keep up. Other times it came in fits and starts. A phrase here, a pause, a rethink, a sigh, and then click another word, another thought made tangible. There was something comforting in that cadence, in knowing that each stroke was a step forward, no matter how small. It wasn't perfect, but was progress. And progress on a typewriter sounded like a room full of tiny hammers trying to build something from nothing. Even the mistakes made noise. The heavy slam of the space bar when you realized you'd gone off track. The frantic tap of the backspace key as you tried to erase the unerasable. The frustrated pull of the paper when you decided to start over. But no matter how it sounded, it always meant the same thing. Someone was thinking, creating, building from scratch. And if you were lucky enough to be in the same room, you felt it. You felt the energy of ideas being born, not silently in someone's head, but loudly, proudly, one keystroke at a time. And when you typed late at night, when the house was quiet, and the only sound was the clatter of your thoughts hitting the page, that noise became something sacred. A declaration, a whisper to the world that even in the stillness, something important was happening. The typewriter didn't just record words. It announced them. It gave them presence. It made them impossible to ignore. And in a world that's grown quieter in its writing, silent keyboards, invisible touchscreens, whispering voice-to-text commands, That old racket starts to feel strangely comforting. It reminds us that creating used to make noise, that expressing ourselves wasn't always neat or quiet or easily undone. It was messy, it was loud, it was brave, and maybe that's why we remember it so fondly, not just for the words we wrote, but for the way it sounded when we wrote them, for the way it filled a room, for the way it told everyone without a single spoken word that something meaningful was underway. Even now, when we hear the sound in a movie or an old recording, our ears perk up, our hearts remember. We can feel the desk under our arms, the resistance of the keys, the soft hum of focus that settled in the room. That sound became a space where our thoughts became visible, where what was inside us stepped forward and introduced itself to the world. It was also a shared experience. In libraries, newsrooms, and offices across the country, the collective clatter of typewriters sounded like progress, like productivity, like purpose. People didn't work in silence, they worked in rhythm. The tempo of the typewriter was the tempo of ambition. In school classrooms, students hunted and pecked their way through essays, learning not just grammar, but patience. In homes, aspiring writers hammered out stories, stopping only when they ran out of ink or energy. In every corner of the world, someone was typing their truth, loudly, imperfectly, and beautifully. And for every person typing, there was someone nearby, listening. A parent in the kitchen, hearing the steady beat of their child's homework. A spouse on the couch, nodding along to the familiar clatter. A neighbor hearing it through the open window on a warm summer night. That sound wove through our lives like a thread of shared intention. We didn't just hear it, we lived with it. It framed our afternoons and filled our evenings. It gave weight to our silence and made our solitude feel less lonely. The sound of a typewriter was a kind of company, a loyal, clacking companion that marked our presence in the world. Even now, when we find one in an antique shop or a forgotten attic, we press a few keys. We wait for the click. We listen for the ding. We remember. And sometimes we close our eyes and let the memory wash over us, not just of the machine, but of who we were when we used it. A young writer full of ideas. A tired student finding their voice. A parent balancing bills and letters late into the night. The typewriter didn't just shape what we wrote, it shaped how we saw ourselves in the moment, and how we hoped to be seen. Every typewriter had its own quirks. Some keys stuck, some letters faded, some space bars squeaked. And yet once you got to know your machine really knew it, it felt less like a tool and more like a collaborator. You adjusted to its rhythm, its resistance, its unique personality. You learned how to coax it, when to press hard, when to ease up. There was a kind of intimacy in that. And then there was the ribbon, that inky lifeline that held the very words we wanted to say. Spools wound tight with black or sometimes red ink, stretched across the machine like the thread of a story waiting to be told. When the ribbon ran dry, you could see the desperation in the ghost words, faintly appearing on the page, like echoes fading into silence. It was the typewriter's way of saying, "I'm tired. I need refilling." Changing the ribbon was a whole ritual. You'd unclip it, careful not to get ink on your fingers, though you always did. You'd thread the new one through the spools, through the guide arms, double-checking the tension. It felt like threading a loom, like preparing to weave something that mattered. We didn't toss old ribbons carelessly. Sometimes we kept them in drawers, half-used, but not quite finished. Proof that we had written something, that we had tried. There was something strangely comforting about those worn-out ribbons. They were physical evidence of effort, of nights spent hunched over a desk, of mornings when inspiration struck before breakfast. And let's not forget the smell. Typewriters had a scent, the faint aroma of ink-metal old paper, and sometimes the lingering trace of correction fluid. That smell was part of the memory. It was the scent of thinking, of trying, of making something from scratch. For many of us, the typewriter lived in a specific place in the house. A corner desk, a back bedroom, a quiet nook. And we can still picture that place. The scuffed wood of the desk, the drawer full of carbon paper, the stack of blank pages waiting to be filled, the little desk lamp that cast long shadows when the rest of the house was asleep. That space wasn't just where we wrote. It was where we dreamed, where we figured out who we were, where we wrestled with big questions and tried to find words for feelings we barely understood. And the typewriter sat there day after day like a patient witness to it all. We may not have said it then, but we knew it deep down. This machine was more than metal and keys. It was a mirror, a diary, a confessional booth, a launch pad. It was where we wrote letters to lovers and rants to newspapers, where we penned apologies we might never send, where we drafted stories that only we would read. It didn't judge. It just listened one click at a time, and the paper, oh, the paper, mattered too. There was something sacred about sliding in a fresh sheet, that satisfying tug as it caught the roller the way it lined up neatly behind the guide. Each sheet was a clean slate, a brand new beginning, a promise. We didn't always know what we were going to say, but the typewriter waited. It never rushed us, never beeped or buzzed. It sat there quietly urging us forward, one word at a time. It let us find our voice without distraction, without comparison, without a delete key. And when we were done there, it was a page full of honest effort, of ideas made real, no file name, no cloud storage, just ink and paper and pride, something you could hold, fold, tuck away, share, or keep secret forever. Sometimes we'd reread what we wrote and cringe. Other times we'd smile. But always, there was a sense of having tried, having shown up, having typed something that mattered. That's what the typewriter gave us, a way to turn our inner lives into something outer, into something real, something loud, something lasting. And maybe that's why we still romanticize them today. Why people collect them, clean them, display them like relics of a sacred ritual. Because they were more than objects. They were instruments of meaning. They reminded us that making something wasn't supposed to be easy or quiet or clean. It was supposed to take effort, to demand attention, to sound like progress. When we think back to the moments we spent with those machines, it's not just the words we remember. It's the feel of the keys, the smell of the ink, the sound of the clack, the flick of the return lever, the hum of concentration. And maybe in the middle of a noisy digital world, we long for that again, for the weight of each word, for the permanence of print, for the patient, persistent tapping of thought becoming form. Because in the end, the typewriter didn't just help us say what we meant. It helped us mean what we said. Long after we boxed them up or gave them away, typewriters continued to live in our memories. We'd see one in an antique shop or a movie and feel that little pull in the chest, a kind of nostalgia that was half memory, half longing. Because the truth is, it was never just about the typing. It was about what it meant to type, to commit, to try. In a world that moves faster and grows noisier, the silence between typewriter clacks now feels sacred. That pause between thoughts, that breath before the next word, it taught us to think before we spoke, to weigh our ideas, to respect the value of a sentence. We didn't have autocorrect, or Grammarly, or spell check. We had to know, or at least try to know. And when we didn't, we paused. We asked. We opened a dictionary and leafed through pages that smelled like libraries and late nights. It slowed us down in the best way. Today, when everything is instant, we sometimes miss that delay, that small resistance, that feeling of earning your progress letter by letter, because maybe that resistance wasn't a flaw, it was a teacher. It made the words matter more, and the permanence of it, how every letter hit the page like a little declaration that left an imprint not just on the paper, but on us. You couldn't just backspace your way out of an awkward thought. You had to own it, or cross it out, or if you were brave, keep going. There was power in that. Power in the imperfections, in the typos, in the corrections scrawled by hand. It made the writing feel more human, more lived in, less polished maybe, but more honest. Some of us still have our old machines, tucked away in basements or attics. Others lost them to time, to moves, to modernity. But we all carry a piece of that rhythm, that click-clack heartbeat, that steady, purposeful way of creating. It shaped how we write today, even when we type on glowing screens, even when we dictate to phones or send thoughts into the cloud. Somewhere deep down, we remember the weight of each word, the pause before the page, the feeling of saying something and hearing it echo in the keys. So maybe that's what we miss most. Not just the machines, but the meaning behind them. The way they held us accountable. The way they listened. The way they asked us to slow down, to care more, to mean every word. And maybe if we're lucky, we carry that with us still. In the care we take with a letter. In the patience we bring to a story. In the quiet pride of making something from nothing, with just our thoughts and our hands. Because even in a world of autocorrect and AI and infinite fonts, the old truth remains. Sometimes the best way to find yourself is by typing your way there. And when we look back, we don't just remember the noise or the machine, we remember the way it made us feel. Capable, thoughtful, present. We remember the ache in our fingers and the satisfaction of that final period. We remember the nights we stayed up late, chasing a thought, across the keys like fireflies in the dark. We remember being young or uncertain or full of hope, and trusting the machine to help us say something true. It wasn't just a tool, it was a companion. So we honor it, in memory, in metaphor, in the ways we still write today. Not with the same sound, perhaps, but with the same soul. Because for everything we've gained in speed, we've sometimes lost in meaning. But the typewriter reminds us still to slow down, to choose our words, to listen to the silence, to believe that even the clumsiest sentence typed with heart can echo for years.